Hey guys, Jim here, and welcome to week 2 of the WLToys budget build. So if you watched last week's episode, you saw that we used Silly Putty to improve that front diff, and we only spent $2. This week is going to be another one of those cheap type of updates so that we can kind of save some of our money for down the road. There's 2 things that I want to address this week. I want to address this shock issue, but first I want to try to change the pinion. And the reason for that is that because this is going to be primarily a crawler, I want a little bit more low speed resolution. One thing we noticed when we were using this is that you don't have much low speed resolution with this. The speed control kind of has a high on-off speed, and because of that it makes some of those low speed maneuvers difficult. And since we're not changing the speed control right now, I want to try to do something just to help us get more low speed resolution. And to do that, we're just going to gear down. The motor will still be turning at the same minimum speed, but that'll translate into a slower wheel speed. And since we still have second gear in this vehicle, if we wanted to do some more high speed trailing, we're still going to have enough speed in second gear. So that's going to be what we do first. So the first thing you need to do to get to your pinion is take the whole cage off. Once that's off, then you can get to your spur gear cover and take that off, and that'll expose your pinion and your spur. So once you get the cover off, now you can just rotate the motor so that the screw holding the pinion to the motor shaft is exposed, and then you just loosen that up and you can slide it right off. Did that f***er strip? That f***er stripped. So one thing I've already learned is that whatever Loctite they used is a lot stronger than the grub screw, because this thing just absolutely destroyed the grub screw. So now this is stuck on the motor shaft, and this just became a project. In my attempt to take off the pinion gear, I managed to strip out the set screw that was in the pinion, and in the process I ultimately ended up ruining the pinion. So when I took the motor out to go deal with that, I also managed to strip this screw out, and so I had to wind up drilling this screw out to get the whole thing apart. In the process, I discovered that the factory pinion and spur are not 48 pitch, but they're actually a mod 0.6 pitch. It looks kind of the same, and it'll actually mesh. If you try to use the non-compatible hardware together, even though they'll mesh, you're going to end up tearing up stuff right away. And I discovered this right away. When I powered up the vehicle, I could tell how noisy it was. So what I ended up having to do was replace the pinion and the spur. This is a 24 tooth pinion, and this is a 69 tooth spur. That gives an overall drive ratio of 2.875 to 1. What I ended up going with is an ECX spur. This is a 48 pitch, so it'll work with all of my pinions. This is an 87 tooth. And for pinions, what I ended up going with, for at least for now, is a 24 tooth pinion. This will provide a gear reduction ratio of about 3.6 to 1, so there's quite a bit more reduction. Obviously I'm going to lose top speed, but I think it's going to help quite a bit with the low speed resolution and the low speed startup. So I've got a couple of these spurs here. I've already got the new one installed. This is an old one that I pulled the slipper pads off of. If you don't buy it with the slipper pads, you can carefully remove the slipper pads from the factory one and move them over. You just may have to do a little bit of trimming, because this uses kind of a D-shaped opening instead of a fully circular opening. So now what you can see is that we've got a much larger spur gear, and we've got smaller diameter but same tooth count on the pinion as the original 24 tooth pinion. And surprisingly, even with this larger spur, there's just enough room to be able to fit the original dust cover in place. And so we're going to be able to retain that as well. So now I'm just going to get this dust cover on, we'll get the body back on, and we'll talk about the shocks. I've got this turned sideways so you can see how much throttle I'm giving it before we get any movement. There's the buzz from the ESC. And there's some movement. So overall, it still requires a real light touch, but it's not too bad. And I think that's going to help us out quite a bit on the trails compared to how it was. Now, if you want even more resolution, you can go into your controller settings and turn down your expo. You'll lose top speed, but you'll get a lot more low speed resolution. For now, I'm going to try it like this because I don't want to lose too much top speed if I can help it. Although with the second gear, we might still be able to be all right. So now we're going to convert this to second gear and try it again. So reverse is still a little bit touchy, and that brings up another point. With this speed control, I don't have the option for a drag brake or forward reverse mode like you would normally have in a crawler. When you go backwards, you get brakes the first time. You've got to double tap the reverse to get it to go backwards. So not ideal for crawling, but for now, it is what it is. Hopefully we'll be able to address that in the future. Okay guys, so now that we've got the body back on, I wanted to talk about the shocks. As I mentioned, I wanted to try putting new oil in these shocks. And I did a lot of experimentation with what few oil grades I had. And I started off with a 40 weight oil and discovered that in the back it was still way too stiff, and in the front it was still nowhere near enough damping. So what I ended up having to do, especially in the front because there just was not nearly enough damping, I ended up going to a 3,000 weight diff oil. Now, a 3,000 weight diff oil isn't 300 times thicker than a 30 weight shock oil. I would guess it's somewhere in the range of between like an 80 or 100 weight shock oil, but I'm not really sure. That said, that gave me a pretty good result up front. It's not perfect, but it's good enough until we get to one of the next stages. In the rear, the 40 weight oil was way too thick. There was still just way too much rigidity in the back. So I tried 30 weight, which is the lowest weight oil I have on hand, still way too thick. So I wound up taking the shocks apart, and inside the pistons there are 3 tiny holes, and I bored each one of those holes a little bit larger. Now, for you to do that, you're going to want to take a real, systematic approach so you don't go too far. Start with 1, maybe 2 holes with just an ever so slightly larger drill bit and work your way up until you get yourself to a point where you're happy. I'm at a point now where I think it's pretty good. It's not perfect, but I think it's good enough until I can start playing with different springs too. So at the beginning of the video, you saw me actuate the suspension. It was sticky and it just didn't work well. Now you can see we've got a pretty good suspension. If we drop the vehicle, it's a lot better. The front isn't bad. The rear isn't too bad considering there's no battery in it, but could perhaps be a little bit thinner. When I lift up the front here, you can see most of my articulations coming from the rear, although up near the end of the stroke I do get some articulation from the front. Now, because we're having so much torque twist on the rear, this lighter setup is going to make it even worse. I'm hoping at some point to run a sway bar. If I run a sway bar, I'm not going to get as much articulation from the rear, so I really need more from the front. But we're going to address the suspension further, and I think we'll be able to get there. For now, I think this is a big improvement. Now I just want to go out and drive it. So this week's total expense was about 10 bucks. I still haven't spent much money because I'm really trying to save up for some larger expenses in the near future. For the new pinion and spur gear, we're in it for about $9. If you need to buy slipper pads for this, you're going to be spending a few more bucks for the slipper pads too. I've got the part numbers below for those parts, so go ahead and check that out. Lastly, I added about $1 for shock oil. Shock oil is one of those things you really need to have it around anyway. It's hard to quantify the value because to buy a bottle of shock oil is obviously more than $1, but you're using a very small amount. So we're going to call it $1. That way we're at a nice even number. 10 bucks for this week. With that said, guys, I really hope you learned something. I think this made some nice improvements to the vehicle for, again, not much money. In the coming weeks, we're going to really start spending some of that money we've been saving up. So make sure you stick around for that. You can make sure you get notifications by clicking the subscribe button and hitting that notification bell right next to it. So until then, guys, thanks very much.